Hey everyone, welcome back to the Phoenix's Tale. I am your host Gabe, and this week we are diving into Chapter 7, Mudbloods and Murmurs. So, let's get to our recap real quick. So after last week, poor Harry had a very rough first day of term with all of his classes and Professor Lockhart. So this chapter opens where it's finally the weekend, and Harry, looking forward to sleeping in, is awoken very early in the morning by Oliver Wood, because we all know Oliver Wood is obsessed with Quidditch. And he wants to get some Quidditch practice in the very first Saturday of term. So, after a very long time in the changing room, listening to all of Oliver's plans for the year and how they're going to do this and do that, they finally make their way onto the Quidditch pitch, and before they can do much more than to, get up in the air and fly around a little bit, here comes the Slytherin team with their brand new brooms and their brand new seeker, Draco Malfoy. There's a bit of an argument when Harry and Ron come to see, Hermione and Ron come to see what's going on, and Hermione saying that, at least the Gryffindor team didn't have to buy their way into the team like Draco Malfoy clearly did. He calls her a mudblood. Ron freaks the fuck out, goes to jinx Malfoy, and his broken wand backfires on him, and he ends up spending the rest of the chapter burping up slugs. So Harry and Hermione decide to take him over to Hagrid's because Professor Snape signed a note saying the Slytherin team could start training their new seeker, so that essentially kicked off the Gryffindor team from the Quidditch pitch and being unable to practice. So Harry and Hermione go over to Hagrid's for help with Ron burping up the slugs, and talk about, a bunch of different things, such as, the defense against the dark arts job being jinxed. I believe this is the first time we hear about that. And that comes into play further on for those who are not familiar with the story. We find out what the term mudblood means. Basically, Hermione's a mudblood, muggle-born. It's just a nasty slur like the N-word for black people. We don't call anybody a mudblood, okay? And the chapter ends with Ron and Harry serving detentions. Ron has to go polish all the trophies in the trophy room and ends up having a very difficult time over a special award an award for special services to the school because he burped slugs all over it. Poor Ron. And Harry's stuck having to address Lockhart's fan mail as his detention. And while he's doing that, he hears this very scary, bone-chilling voice talking about wanting to kill somebody. And Lockhart doesn't hear it. So the chapter ends where the boys are back in their dormitory, and Harry's telling Ron about the voice and what it said, and that Lockhart didn't hear it, and what the fuck's going on. So that's kind of where we leave the chapter this week. We are going to be digging back into some private stuff, and this is some stuff that I haven't talked about in detail in a while, so, certainly not since Sorcerer's Stone. So we're going to dive into it a little bit, because what I picked up on, first of all, when I did the research for this episode, was Harry doing his best to avoid Lockhart. Okay, after his disastrous first day of school, and Lockhart cornering him several times, giving him his advice and everything. And so Harry decides he's just going to do his best to avoid Lockhart whenever possible. And that one really struck out to me. So we're going to talk about it. Because this is not unlike all the times I wanted to avoid my own father, especially after my parents' divorce. So I'm going to share a couple stories as to why this was the case for me. And because these memories are key to what I call my epiphany moment and how things shifted for me and being able to heal from a lot of the damage that my father did throughout my childhood. So both of these stories involve social situations with my father. Now, according to him, my father, it was mandatory for my brothers and I to attend social situations with him. What do I mean by that? The first one I'm going to talk about is the annual picnic that the company he worked for, my father's employer, would do every year for its employees. And I remember going to those when my parents were still married, and those were fun. But this was the first one. I think this story goes back to the first one I had to do without my mom. Might have been the second one. I only went to like one or two after that, but I believe it was the first one that we had to attend with my father post-divorce, so my mother wasn't around. Unfortunately, the friends I had in that situation, children of one of my father's co-workers, we were all kind of about the same age, they weren't there that year. And when I asked their mom, it was that they just didn't want to go, so they got to stay at Grandma and Grandpa's or with a friend or something like that. I don't remember, but they didn't want to go, and their parents were kind enough. Well, you can stay with Grandma and Grandpa if you want. Okay, yeah, that sounds great. So they weren't there. Now, I was about 12 or 13 at the time. And the only people I had to socialize, therefore, this particular year were my brothers, who were, I think I was 13, so we're going to go with that age. So that would have put California brother at 11 and Michigan brother at 8 years old. Definitely ages where they didn't want big sister around. Okay. And the rest of the children who were young enough to put me in a babysitter role, they were younger than Michigan brother, who, like I said, was 8 at the time. And I hated children. I don't mean it that way. I'm not talking like Annie, it's a hard knock life. I'm not talking about that. I hated children. I never wanted to babysit. I never wanted to be around kids. It wasn't like I was beating them up or anything, but I wasn't comfortable with kids. I didn't want children. I didn't want to babysit or anything like that. But when the only children I had to play with, other than my brothers, who didn't want me around, or my friends who weren't there because they just didn't want to go and got to stay with Grandma and Grandpa, were kids young enough where I'm in that babysitter role. No fucking way, thank you. And on top of that, I was shy and quiet and already had the responsibility of caring for my brothers, being that we were the original Gen X latchkey kids after my parents' divorce. So essentially I was alone to entertain myself because I was too scared of the high school kids, especially since I didn't know any of them. And I doubt my father would have wanted me hanging out with high school kids anyway, but I was stuck. I had no one to talk to during this thing, and it was fucking hours that we were there. Ugh. Anyway, let's get some zen. At one point, I had voiced my boredom to my father, and he shouted at me a little bit and ended up pointing to 2 grown women sitting together at one of the picnic tables and saying, well, there's people I can talk to. And then he storms off. Excuse me? Grown-ass women are not going to want to sit and talk to a 12, 13-year-old girl on her own. Oh, God, my father was so woefully stupid about shit like that. Anyway, That was the response I got. Moving on. Another memory that is quite similar to this, and it occurred a couple years later at his employer's annual softball tournament. And this was an inter-office thing because he worked for a company that had offices in multiple states over on the West Coast. And this particular year, we were in Bend, Oregon for this thing. And it was a weekend trip. I did get to bring my best friend at the time with us, but she was nearly as bad as my father with the verbal abuse bullshit. And we'll be talking about her eventually, throughout this series. So we'll be diving into some details about her that I remember, but she was just as bad as my father, really. But I ended up just being so miserable there too. And you know how sometimes when you're in situations that all you want to do is you just want to go home and you're like on the verge of tears because you're tired, you're cranky, you feel uncomfortable because you're in a different situation. Maybe you don't, but I do. That's where I was. And I just wanted to go home. And when I voiced this to my father, he just shouted at me about it and walked away. Just like he did at the picnic. Well, there's people you can talk to. He just shouted at me. I don't even remember what he said. But it was the lack of sympathy. It was the lack of empathy behind it. And yeah, that was his reaction to everything. That is what I remember. Just being shouted at, being insulted. It was all my fault that I was so fucking bored. And to a point when you're that young, okay, yeah, start taking some of that responsibility for myself. But I'm still a child. I'm still a minor. I am not a legal adult. On some level, that's still his goddamn responsibility. And this shit was mandatory. My brother and I were just talking about that a couple hours ago. And I mentioned it in one of the previous episodes. I'm kind of doing 3 or 4 of these back to back, recording them to get caught up for you, everybody out there. But it was this kind of thing that he and I were talking about. That shit was mandatory. And I mean, he would lose his shit if he said, you know what, I don't want to go. Well, you're supposed to go, and you're supposed to do this, and you're supposed to do that. And, how about you're supposed to shut the fuck up? And if your kids don't want to do something, don't force them to do something. Anyway, I'm going to go off on a lot of these tangents, and I'm going to do my best to stick to my notes with this episode. But these are at the forefront of my mind. So, getting back to my father's reaction, that's just how I remember him reacting to anything. Anytime my brothers and I voiced our own needs or wants in any way, he shouted at us and shamed us and insulted us for not being good enough per his opinions. I shared a while back my story about the dishwasher incident. How he completely lost his shit over me because I didn't load the dishes in the dishwasher in the same places that he did. Yeah. So, what does all of this have to do with wanting to avoid him? Well, if you haven't figured that out by now, I'm sorry. But it had everything to do with it. Because I was always dismissed for voicing anything that I wanted or needed. And the same with my brothers. I've seen it, as I got older and was more aware of my father's bullshit and behaviors towards me, and seeing the same bullshit behaviors towards my brothers. Children stop being so egocentric. The world revolves around them, and they eventually start becoming more aware of the people around them. Normal human behavior. But this has everything to do with why I wanted to avoid him. I was always dismissed for voicing anything that I wanted or needed. Same with my brothers. And for years, it was this constant wavering between pretending to be the good, obedient daughter and just wanting my father to go away. Interestingly, I never wanted him dead, but I did want him to leave me alone. And I had a lot of fantasies, especially in that 2.5, 3 year period between my folks splitting up, and then we moved back here to Michigan. Same house. I'm going to say that a lot. Same house. Because this was my grandma's house originally. She's still alive, but she can't live here. She's 97. You know, she's got stairs and it's just a mess. But in that period when we were still in California, from the divorce up until the point we moved here, there were a lot of fantasies about my father being caught for something and going to jail, or losing his custody and we don't have to see him. Those were the types of things that I was thinking about. You know, I wasn't thinking about horrific car crashes that ended his life or anything like that. It was always very, can't he just go to jail for something? Or can't he lose his custody for something? I fantasized about that a lot when I was that age. And thankfully by then I was less than 10 years away from having my epiphany moment, which changed everything. So we're going to shift here a little bit because I was kind of having a hard time kind of pulling things together in my brain. So just bear with me. I'm going to be reading directly from what I wrote. Here is a moment where I had to utilize my perplexity tool, which is my favorite chat GPT-esque tool, to help me. And an interesting question came up. How did Harry's awareness of his experience of Lockhart and understanding how fake he was versus how others around him saw Lockhart? Hermione, for example, compared to my own experience with my father. And when I read that question, I immediately thought of the times that I thought this very thing with my father. I couldn't understand how he actually had friends when he treated my brothers and me the way he did. Of course, now I can see that my father is all about the external validation, just like Lockhart. But as we talked about last week, when going through the definitions of Machiavellianism and narcissistic personality disorder, and at the end of the episode, I said something about how I'm seeing more and more misuse or ideas that people have that, oh, everybody's a little autistic, everybody's a little narcissistic. Not that I'm qualified to provide a diagnosis for my own father. I'm not. But based on my experience, based on what I know, thanks to my bachelor's degree, I would not diagnose my father as having narcissistic personality disorder. This would be an excellent example of having narcissistic tendencies, because in my father's behaviors, I don't see him being the more grandiose Howard Hughes, Adolf Hitler, Donald Trump type. You know, my father he employed gaslighting a lot, which is a narcissistic tendency. But to diagnose my father as a narcissist, no, it doesn't quite fit, because there isn't enough criteria, at least based on what my experience of him was and my knowledge, my actual education. So my father would be an excellent example of somebody who has some narcissistic traits, but not enough, according to the DSM, to diagnose him as being narcissistic, if that makes any sense. But I really couldn't understand I couldn't understand how this man ever had any friends. And, building his life on this external need. It might be further on in my notes, but going back to these mandatory things that my father insisted. We had to go to the company picnic every year. We had to go to that stupid softball tournament. We have to go here. We had to go there with him. Was his very low self-esteem, insecure way of, oh, look at me. I'm divorced, but I'm still such a good dad because my kids are here. Never mind the fact that he did not give a shit that his kids didn't want to be there. And never mind that he didn't give a shit how his children were feeling about that. To me, at the age of 12, 13 years old, it was very clear to me that that was his way of that external validation. Because he has no internal validation. He has no self-confidence. He has no self-esteem. He has very low self-worth. But I wouldn't call it narcissism. Okay. There is a deeper aspect to this that I have struggled with throughout my entire life. And, yeah, we're going to dive into it. And that is the idea of settling for the people you have in your life, because somehow being single romantically, specifically, or only having a couple of solid friends, being an introvert, for example, is wrong. We have this overarching idea in this country that being single and not having a lot of friends, even though I'm at a point now where I love being single. I get to control my life. I don't have to worry about what some jackass thinks my life should be like. I lived that with my father and was seriously disappointed. And I myself at one point had no self-esteem, very low self-worth, no self-confidence, none of that. Now I'm like, yeah, I'm good. And yes, I do want people in my life, but I'm very specific about that now and will be moving forward, seeing as how I'm extremely socially isolated now. And for some reason that popped into my head. So let me start over with that paragraph. The idea of settling for people just to have someone. That's the piece I missed. Because somehow being single romantically, not only having a couple solid friends, is wrong. And his mindset is that, and my father's mindset is very much like this, that you have to have a lot of friends. And you have to be married, or at the very least, you have to be part of a couple. And I really started laughing the other night when I was writing this part of the episode, because when I've observed how my father is in his friendships and his romantic relationships, he clearly does what you're supposed to do instead of doing the work to figure out who he wants in his life. I've been over 20 years no contact with him, so I don't know what his life really looks like anymore. But when I was still involved with that, it was like he was just settling. Because, you're supposed to have all these things. You're supposed to be married. You're supposed to have a lot of friends. And he's just one that's never going to figure that out. And I don't know why it's so funny to me, but it was funny in more of an ironic kind of way, I guess. But, yeah, I mean, everything about my life right now would be 100% completely wrong if he had any idea what it entailed right now, because, that's just how he is. For example, I'm looking at my notes here. I'm quite certain, more specifically, that my lack of friends currently And the fact that my longest romantic relationship lasted 5 months. And I'll be 54 in a couple weeks as I'm recording this. 1, 2, yeah, about 2.5 weeks. That would get quite a lecture from him, or a lot of, well, maybe you should do this, and maybe you should go take a class and meet some people, and maybe, just all of this unwarranted, unasked for opinions about my life. No conversation, no questions, no, what's going on with you, or how are things, nothing like that. And instantly, on the other side of the coin of that, it would be dismissing everything that I could tell him that I want in my life. I want to go back to school and get my PhD. I want to move back to California. I only want a few good friends in my life, but I want some really good, solid friends that support and love and nourish and cheerlead and, all of these things. I know what I want my life to be like. That wouldn't be good enough for him. Anyway, let's get back to the main point. I have never understood how my father actually got married 3 times. Unless you factor in low self-esteem, you do what you're supposed to do, and you settle for whoever will take you, kind of a thing. But he's been married 3 times. My mom was the first. There was a second one in there not long before we moved back here to Michigan in 1985. I remember going to that wedding, which happened over Thanksgiving or something like that. I don't remember the exact, but it was about a month or so before we left and moved back here to Michigan originally in 1985. And by the time my mom, my brothers, and I got back out there, because that was part of the deal, we had to spend summers with my dad. That marriage was done and gone, and she was gone. Okay. And then now my current stepmom, who again, I'm not that close to. I really don't care. Anyway, but that's something that I've just never understood, is how he even had friends in the first place, how he got married 3 times. And it's like, not to say that I'm better than my father, but I have definitely done the work to be a better version of myself than my father ever has. And I know I'm not perfect. I know I've got a lot of issues. I know I've got a lot of trauma. I know I'm a mess. I know I'm a handful. But I'm also a lot more particular about who I want in my inner circle. And for my father, the fact that my longest romantic relationship lasted 5 months would be completely wrong. There's something wrong with me, and whatever. And I've always wondered what it would be like to be a fly on the wall in his social interactions, because what little I did see and was aware of definitely showed that his friends knew nothing of his true nature. I saw 2 very different people. I saw my father socially. I saw my father personally at home with his family. Mask off, guard down. He is 2 different people. Not in a psychotic way, but in a very insecure way, if that makes any sense. Unfortunately, we had to survive the worst of the 2. And somehow we have. Miraculously. Anyway. Ever since my epiphany moment, so many things about my father have come to light. And the most profound for me was realizing that once the doubt crept in, when it came to who I thought I was, based largely upon my father's treatment of me up to that point, I was just shy of turning 22. So we're talking 32 years ago. When my epiphany moment happened. after the epiphany moment, one of the outcomes of that for me was after realizing that no, I'm not a priority to my father. My brothers and I don't think ever crossed the top 10 because there was always something or someone more important to him based on his actions. So why should I keep worrying about him being proud of me when up to this point he clearly never has? And why do I keep busting my butt over this? And then I started thinking about how he had treated me the whole time and the fact that I got to a conclusion like that at the age of 22. That's when the doubt crept in. That's when I thought, well, if he's never been proud of me and he's never been he's never prioritized his children, what if he's wrong about me? And for me, something like that is a killer. And it killed our relationship right then and there. Even though it took me quite a long time to see it. Because I started doubting everything. I doubted the fact that he always treated me like I was stupid. I doubted the fact that I was lazy. Maybe I'm not lazy. And it turns out I wasn't lazy. It turns out I'm autistic and was heavily masking. And so I'd get home from school and I'd be fucking exhausted. And I would rarely go outside to play because I was always so fucking exhausted from all the masking I was doing. I'm not fucking lazy. I am rather intelligent. And even if I were average intelligent, I am driven. I am determined. I am whatever it takes to complete something, such as my bachelor's degree, which was 100% online. It wasn't a COVID thing. It was 100% online from the get-go. But to have the discipline to do the work, to stay up with the work and blah, 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 without having that daily reminder of going to class every day. My father created a daughter who in her 20s didn't believe that she would be capable of doing something like this. But then I started doubting, and it was that doubt. It was that doubt that changed everything, because I am curious by nature. So whenever somebody tells me something or says something that doesn't seem right to me, it kind of sounds like bullshit. I have to do my own research. I have to appease my own curiosity. I have to appease that, okay, this sounds like bullshit. Let me see what's going on. And as somebody who has always been very particular about where I get my information, you may notice, if you have been looking into the show notes, that a lot of the information that I provide and the references for my links are peer-reviewed. That means other psychologists have studied this and they've done research and they've used the scientific method and blah, 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 and proven a lot of these things, as opposed to Wikipedia. You don't use Wikipedia in college. That will not fly. Because it is so haphazard. But that's the kind of research that I do. And even when I was younger, it may not necessarily have been that peer-reviewed stuff, but it's definitely from a source who would know better than my father. Okay? So I started doing research. Because now all of a sudden, the question of the decade for me was, what if my father's wrong? What if I really am smart? What if I really am driven? What if I really do have some strengths and some talents and natural aptitudes for things? What if I really am, what do they call it? Dedicated, consistent. All of the things needed to succeed, all of the things needed to learn new things. It was that what if. And it was based on that one question. What if he's wrong? So, because of him, I always felt like my wants and my needs didn't matter, because to him they didn't, and they still don't, and they never will. I also believed, like I said, I believed that I was stupid, lazy, worthless, had no strengths, abilities, natural talents, etc. Literally believing that my existence truly was a mistake, and that all I was meant to do was to fuck things up and not contribute anything positive to the world. But once I started doubting his assertions based on his behaviors towards me, actions speak louder than words, his position in my life was over, like I said. Despite the fact that it took another 10 years or so for me to finally go no contact with him, it was really when I sat down to research and write this episode that I realized, oh, the second I doubted when I was not quite 22 years old, that's what ended the relationship. So, naturally, once I did go no contact, there was so much more about myself that I was finally free to question and explore, which ultimately led to changing, healing, growing, to the point where I am literally no longer that person anymore. And when I say literally, I mean literally. I changed my legal name about 3 years after the epiphany moment, because so much had changed in my own mindset about myself that my birth name, the one my parents gave me, felt wrong, and I needed a new name. And that's how Gabriella, I'm not going to do my last name right now, but my last name is not my father's name. It's my mother's maiden name now. So I've been Gabriella since I was 24, 25 years old. So 30 years. And it was all because I had that freedom once I finally, and he didn't like it at first because I still had contact with him. But after I went no contact and I just had more and more freedom to question and to research and explore, I think about all of the cool shit that I have done since the epiphany moment, all the cool shit I've done since I've gone no contact, that 22-year-old me, just before the doubt crept in, just before my brain asked the question, what if he's wrong? I never thought possible. And not that my life has been amazing since then, but I am certainly much happier in my life despite my current circumstances. No car, no income, haven't had a job in 10 years. My 77-year-old mother, who I'm living with, has cancer and is still working 30 hours a week and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, there's a lot of shit going on and a lot of stress. But overall, I am still much happier with myself and with my prospects moving forward, because I know I am worth it. I know I can do this. Apparently, there have been a lot of lessons I've had to learn over the last 12 years. But so much better than I felt about myself 32 years ago. Because I have proven to myself over and over again that I am capable, I am intelligent, I am driven when something captures my curiosity and or my interest, and that I am worthy of having the right people for me in my life. And this is where we now need to return to Harry. So, one of the key things I noticed over the many rereadings of the series is that I picked up, one of the key things that I picked up is the fact that despite the similarities in upbringing for me and Harry was immediately placed in a situation where he did have the right people around him, and thus I think was a lot quicker at trusting himself and what he knew to be right, true, authentic about himself. It's taken me a lot longer to get there, which shows the clear difference between my journey and Harry's. But like I said, I'm getting there. I've certainly learned a lot about myself over the last 12 years of PTSD, which has led to my current state of social isolation. The most profound being that I am worthy of having the right people in my life, and that solitude is not a bad thing. I'd much rather continue with my social isolation as it is now than to go back to having any of the people from my past back in my life, because in some way or shape or form, they were not the right people. Because if they were the right people, they'd still be here. They'd still be part of my life. And it is much more peaceful and a lot more entertaining, because I certainly do, for the most part, entertain myself real well. I cannot tell you how many times in the middle of the night, if I'm still awake, tossing and turning, and I see something on TikTok that just cracks me up, I am laughing out loud, like rolling, not on the floor, I'm in bed, but, just gut-busting laughter. I can entertain myself really well. And having such a long-term social isolation has helped me see what I want coming in because of that peace that I am feeling. I don't have to put that mask on for anybody anymore. And I'm not going to moving forward. So when I start meeting new people again and start making new friends, I'm going to be a lot more discerning about it. So that is one of the key differences that I notice between my story and Harry's story is at the age of 11, he had all these people who were the right people for him. I still haven't quite found that, although I have found that at times throughout my life. High school, because when we moved after my parents' divorce, we moved over Christmas break of 1985, I think it was. Yeah, 1985. I was halfway through my freshman year of high school. So I essentially spent high school here and I graduated here. Same high school half my family graduated from. So, I kind of like that. But it was a much better period of time for me. And the friends that I did have, again, I wouldn't want to go back and revisit, but there is one that I can count on to this day, that if I called her up, hey, I know it's been years, I really need to talk about something, she would absolutely be there for me as much as I would be there for her, because she is that person for me. The way our lives are now, it's just, whatever. I don't talk to her. I have no desire to try to rebuild a friendship or anything like that, because our lives are so different. But if I needed her, or if she needed me, and she was one of my best friends in high school, and not having to deal with my dad for 9 months out of the year made it so much better. So I do have pockets of time throughout my life. Really, high school was the first time I felt like, okay, to some degree. There was still a lot of masking. There was still a lot of lack of confidence. There was still a lack of self-esteem. There was still a low self-worth that I felt about myself. But it was also better than I'd ever experienced. I felt better about myself overall. Not the way I do now. I still don't recognize who that girl was in high school. But because I have changed that much and been through so much, done so much healing, done all that shadow work, if you're in the tarot, witchy woo-woo world, which I kind of am. But yeah, I've had pockets, but unlike a lot of people, any of those childhood friends, those people are long gone, and not a single solitary person except my son, my mother, and my baby brother are still in my life. and having that separation from society. Just completely, it is lonely at times, I'm not going to lie, but overall, I don't have to mask. I can do whatever I want with the financial limits that I currently have, but I can watch what I want. I can do whatever workouts I want to do. I can read whatever I want to read. I can go where I want to go. Yeah. Again, for the most part, have to use mom's car, but I don't have money, so, what does it matter? And I'm not going to spend hers except for food. So the social isolation has given me a much clearer perspective of who I want to bring into my life, because overall, this is probably the most peaceful on a certain level that I have ever felt in my life. And I ain't giving that up for just anybody. So, as I mentioned a couple episodes ago, yeah, you absolutely have every right to be as picky as you want to be, to have however high a standard you want for somebody. The fine line comes between that and perfectionism. I'm not looking for perfect. I'm just looking for perfect for me. They're still a flawed human being and a flawed individual. That's totally fine. But as long as them green flags outweigh the red flags, and whatever red flags are there are little tiny ones that we can work around, I'm going to be extremely picky about who gets to be in my inner circle moving forward. So I didn't mean to go off on that tangent. So let's wrap things up. Yeah, we strayed a little bit from the chapter, but this is just what happens when I do my research sometimes. And the entire point of the podcast is to draw these things out of my head. So sometimes it's going to be Harry Potter heavy. Sometimes it's going to be psychology heavy. Sometimes this is going to be my life heavy. So just roll with it. Where's my notes? I lost my spot. So anyway, it was a bit of a ride this week. Got a little personal, got a little vulnerable, so I'm going to do a little self-care now. So on that note, let's wrap it up for the week. Next week, we are going to be analyzing Chapter 8, The Death Day Party. And until then, remember, please, please, please don't do magic with a broken wand. I don't want you burping up slugs. Okay? All right. Have a good week, everyone.